Welcome to episode 3 of the Snobcast. We will be discussing the movie The Cabin in the Woods. As always, this episode will contain spoilers. We will be discussing the movie from beginning to end.
How can the ritual be complete?
The virgin's death is optional as long as it's last. Main thing is that she, suffers.
That she did.
It's so strange. I'm actually rooting for this girl. She's got so much heart. You think of all the pain and the... Tequila is my lady! My lady! Come on in, guys. Come on in, come on in. You're welcome. Tequila! From darkness, there is light!
Welcome. My name's Jeff Bateman, and with me today is Steve.
But of course.
Joseph.
Yep.
And David.
Hello.
Cabin in the Woods is...
the cure for the common indie filmmaker.
Nerdgasm?
A movie.
That's very astute.
It's a message to new horror film directors.
Now, why? Why is it a message to new horror indie film directors? I think it is because, the movie is just littered with cliches, but with each cliche, there's a hand and a button and a dial, like, working behind those cliches, so it kind of unravels it and makes them more plain and obvious, and it would give anyone wanting to make a slasher film more pause before they start committing those cliches, because then everyone around is thinking about the control room where they're working the gears and pushing buttons and stuff like that, you know?
Unless the most important thing to you as a producer or a filmmaker is that you make your money back, in which case you haven't seen Cabin in the Woods.
Does making a cliche mean you're going to get your money back?
I think most people would.
That's
would
very,
say.
very cynical.
But I mean, how the slasher genre hasn't changed in 30 years.
Nope. It made it a big event, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. It's a message to new horror film directors of what not to do.
In fact, it's kind of like Scream,
and
except it takes it a step further.
It takes it.
It takes it many steps further.
Yeah,
it takes it into a whole other dimension.
I was going to say it takes it probably a good 4 or 5 steps. There was several spots where I was like, oh, this will be the end of the movie.
And every step is in the right direction, too.
Oh, completely. Yeah, completely. I would say it's nerdgasm just for that reason.
Because this could be for fans of horror movies, too. You know?
I wonder about that. When I saw this in the theater and it was packed, and there were people that didn't know what the movie was. I didn't really either.
Were they coming in from the trailer, which kind of sold it as kind of a straight kind
of slasher movie where it's kind of like, well, this is what you go see on a Friday night. This is the time of year it is. It's also, by the way, this was released, if I remember right, in one of the dead zones, probably like March, right? Like mid-March.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Where that telegraphs to me that the studio is like, well, we got to release this. We paid for it. We got to see if we can make our money back. And it's one of those cases where it's like they didn't really know what they had.
So you think a lot of people went into the movie with misconceptions?
I think so.
So what is the movie? If we could talk about that a little bit.
What is the movie?
What is Cabin in the Woods?
It's a dark comedy.
Is that the best way to define it if you had to put it in a genre?
Yeah, it's a horror comedy.
It would fit a dark comedy really well, actually. But I'm trying to think of another example.
There's not one kill that happens that doesn't have a thing about it.
Yeah.
Well, what I think about it is that makes it kind of brilliant is it starts out with, a premise that it lets you know a little bit by bit by bit, and then when things finally spill over, you're engaged enough to where it's the most awesome thing that you've seen, in a horror movie.
That's what I felt like.
It just leads you every step of the way. By the time we're spoiling, so when the doors open on the SWAT team, you're already just so enthralled and loving it and stuff like that. If it wasn't paced correctly, that probably wouldn't have had such as good a punch as it had. But because it started out with the premise and you were kept inside that premise, and then we're pushing against the walls of that premise, and we're pushing further and further, and all of a sudden we're cracking the walls. Like, are we gonna? Yeah, okay, let's just break the walls open, and then we're just let hell unleash itself inside the movie.
That's kind
great.
And I think it's pretty crucial to mention that the movie, in fact, starts out with the what's his name? Sitterson and Hadley. It starts out with them. It doesn't start out with the 5 college students. and it starts cracking jokes immediately.
You're
and
absolutely
then at
correct.
the end of that scene, boom, like Cabin in the Woods with like a shriek, I think, slams on the screen, and then you cut to
No, it's
where a
funny.
normal horror movie would start.
That Cabin in the Woods would not have been as good if it started out with the 5 and then it comes up to the guy with the earphone on the roof saying da da da, because then that's the part where the movie's going, maybe there's more going on.
Right,
than
and
you
I think that's the opposite of what Prometheus, which we talked about last week, did.
Exactly.
The thing that's really interesting about it, I thought, in terms of how it's structured, is it does have those two stories that are kind of going on simultaneously. And I felt like anytime I was kind of getting bored, or like I understood the concept, or how do I want to say this, where the metaphor was really two-dimensional with like, okay, there's the jock and there's, the stoner, and I was like, okay, I get it. Like, yes, you're playing this very straight. We get this. Anytime I felt like I was getting bored with that, they would always bring in that second storyline with the, like, I guess you would call them the operators, or dare I say, engineers.
Yeah, engineers.
So whenever in a typical horror movie, the characters would just be spewing those terrible lines and that cliched, cheesy dialogue. Instead, it's cutting to the director or the engineers and
we're kind of in control of it all.
Exactly. So and then we're getting comedy from their side.
They're also controlling the cliches too. Like when one of them releases that gas that makes one of them go, "We should split up, cover more ground." Like that's the answer to why do characters make stupid decisions like that? It's because there's a control man pushing the make them make stupid decisions gas.
Yeah, and when she picks up that knife in the basement, he pushes a button and it shocks her hand and she drops it.
Yeah.
Which is
That
another
answers
thing
the question,
that
why do they
people
drop
yell
the-
at the movie theater screen for.
Basically, there's a bad writer in control of all of this.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
It's doing things that people would
Or
never
like
do.
Confused Matthews, a wizard did it. I think he would like this movie actually.
Probably.
Yeah, I get the feeling he would like this movie.
In fact, let's all go check his website right now.
Let's go check, see what he says about this movie.
We are talking about something.
Do you guys remember seeing this movie for the first time and not knowing what was going on?
I
was
was exactly
giddy.
I knew exactly what was going on.
I think that's where
I figured it was like it was. Have we seen that? We've seen that before, right? Where it's a reality. Well, I immediately thought Truman Show meets slasher movie.
actually to
That's what I thought.
to pull a horror geek reference on you. I think Halloween Resurrection did it before all of them. In Halloween Resurrection, which also featured Busta Rhymes, but other than this fact, which is they go to the Michael Myers, or I should say the Myers house, and they have a reality show, and it's like, we're going to stay in the Myers house, brah. We're going to see what happens. And then, of course, Michael Myers is there, and he kills everybody. But it was in that guise of like, this is a reality show, and,
Right.
and we're in control of this. So it's like taking that to the several times more.
Was it the fifth Freddy Krueger movie where
Freddy's
it was
Dead?
Yeah, no, it was where they acknowledged that Freddy Krueger's just a movie, except Freddy Krueger busts out of the movie.
Yeah.
And
Freddy's Dead, the 3D one, yeah.
What are you saying? Huh? What do you want? You think I'm a puppet, huh? You think I'm a puppet gonna do a little fucking puppet dance? I'm the boss of my own brain, so give it up. I'm gonna go for a walk.
So do you think that the writers for this movie really wrote themselves as the stoner character who sees everything and is sort of the hero of the movie?
I think that's pretty, especially in these
And isn't that like an especially cliched Joss Whedon character?
completely. I mean, I'm not a Joss Whedon expert, but I would say,
do we have a Joss Whedon expert?
we could probably contact somebody.
Josh Wheaton?
Well, I thought he was Josh. So
Josh.
I could hardly be the expert here.
Josh Wheathens. But I can't really vouch for that. But I can say that it's really stereotypical in terms of like these are the characters that the audience is supposed to identify with and kind of root for. Kind of the virgin and the stoner, right? And I think we're supposed to be annoyed with the jock and the whore to some degree.
But that's
Yeah.
Thor.
Yeah, we're supposed. Yeah. I don't think the movie positioned us to be sympathetic towards the whore, the jock, as much.
But I mean, hey, you're right. It's Thor, and we do
So,
like Thor.
Yeah.
Can't really be mad at Thor.
And you never really get too attached to those characters, like you were saying earlier with the split narrative.
it's a fine line, but where you can sympathize with them enough to watch them, but you're not just waiting for them to die, which I feel like is something that happens in all of these series where they just keep going and keep going. Eventually the monster becomes the star of the show. What comes to mind is, again, Nightmare on Elm Street, where it's just like, you're just like, God, I wish Freddy would come here and just say something witty and then just kill these people. I can't wait for that to happen, because they're not characters. They're just
Yeah.
like, they're not even cliches.
They're
just
targets.
Yeah, they're just somebody to...
There's someone for you to see naked and then watch them get killed.
Yeah, because they got naked. So something we were trying to decide on too was what role that the people we have dubbed the engineers, and by we I mean me, what role are they symbolically filling?
They're filling what makes the cliches work, you know.
I think they're the writers.
So are they the writers and filmmakers, or are they the audience?
They're the writers and the filmmakers.
Yeah.
The gods are the audience.
And when it doesn't go the exact way that they want it to go, then they cast it down?
Wrath comes in the form of blogs.
The reason we get so many horror movies like this is because the gods are requiring them once a year. That's what they imply, that they do it every now and again.
Yeah.
I don't know if they, specifically say how often, but that's why we get horror. That's why it's like a fairy tale where horror movies come from.
And that's why every country's involved too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Japan's making their ghost girl movies, you know.
And like that one failed. It wasn't a hit.
And what were they saying about like how the Japanese always are beating us? And
That's because there was a while when Japan was taken over in the horror market, and then we started making The Grudge and shit like that.
So the early 2000s was
Yeah,
that kind of
that
J
was-
horror wave.
I think my favorite cliche in the movie is Mordecai the Harbinger, because he does a pretty amazing job intimidating the kids, being funny, and then when he speaks with the engineers on the phone, that's probably the funniest scene in the movie.
That's where I think the audience
One
is...
of the funniest.
Yeah, that's where I think the audience is kind of let in on it. I remember watching that distinctly the first time. I was like, man, this is really on the nose. And I was kind of on the fence about it. But then once you have that phone conversation, it's like, oh, okay. You get the tone of the movie then, I think. Even with that intro.
Right.
Which kind of lets you in. I think
Because the intro could have easily still been pretty menacing, with the guy on the roof and talking about the chemicals they're using and all of that stuff.
Yeah. So it kind of lets the audience in. It's like, oh, this is the tone of the movie. I think that's the exact scene where you're kind of like, okay, I get it. And you kind of follow it the rest of the way.
Yes.
I feel like they probably worked a lot on the editing for this, getting that pacing just right and knowing right when to cut back to, the different parts of the story. Sometimes, I've seen this movie 3 times now, and I kind of wonder if they reveal too much too soon. I think maybe it'd be a little more fun not if it was to trick us into thinking it was a regular horror movie, but just not give us so much right away, because you get the point pretty early on that they're in control of what's happening.
That's kind of an important decision to make, actually. How much time were we spending with the cliches? How much time are we spending with these engineers? And how do you give enough information with each of those stories to keep all of those things going at once to the finale of the movie, basically?
I actually really liked the way it was paced. I find that, the first 45 minutes of a horror movie tend to drag on and take way too long, and I lose interest. But here, they sort of really hit you quick with with basically just explaining all of the character roles and kind of giving you an idea of what's going on.
Do you think that's because they're cross-cutting like that between the two storylines? Is that why you feel like it's pretty zippy?
Yeah, it cuts out all of the line, limiting the lines of all of these cliche characters makes it so you only use your gems. You don't have to write in a bunch of fluff.
Because there usually is a lot of fluff.
Exactly.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because I feel like this movie kind of walks that thin line between parodying itself so much that it becomes what it's parodying. I think that movie House of the Devil did. But my point being that this movie could have ended up being too boring, but I think we got to that point earlier that the characters actually are interesting enough that we're...
It keeps all those plates spinning at the same time. It keeps all those, and also that's actually what I wanted to mention earlier. Is it has that very kind of straightforward, to use the word again, cliche with the 5 characters, but also there's kind of a mystery that's being revealed with the kind of the meta text in terms of who are these people, what are they talking about, like what is this place, this like mission control place, like what is this about? And they don't in the first time you see them say like, hey, we got to appease another day, another appeasement of the gods. It's kind of this slow reveal, and that keeps you interested in that story, I think. Like I was definitely noticing like all of these little bits and pieces.
Yeah, that's right. I complain that they maybe give a little too much too soon, but you don't really get any information about the gods and the sacrificing until later, and that's what you become interested in. So there is like this third layer.
This we offer in humility and fear, for the blessed peace of your eternal slumber, as it ever was.
As it ever was.
I can distinctly, when we were watching it again, I can distinctly remember it's like this interesting decision, because it's like it is for them, at least in terms of how they deal with it, another day at the plant, right? Like they're talking about their lives outside of work and blah blah blah. But after that first death, they like kiss that pendant and recite that thing. It kind of actually, in a weird way, it reminded me of Evangelion with the mission control, everything, and it's kind of like, oh wait, they're like actually serious about this. This is like isn't a joke. This isn't a day job. This is like something that they're actually doing for real. It's almost like if Nerve was just filled with blue collar guys that were just there to punch a clock.
It'd be Cabin in the Woods.
It would be Cabin in the Woods, basically.
I think that the character that plays the guard for the operating room was pretty interesting.
He's also kind of an audience character. Like he has to
exactly.
He's a voice of
he's
reason.
Like a moral compass sort of character.
important to have, though, right?
Yeah,
Because
Definitely,
he is. Yeah.
definitely.
Yeah.
not only do you have to have things kind of explained to you sometimes, but you also kind of have to get your bearings where you're like, what?
Right, and he's asking questions and he's frowning, so you know that you should be frowning at this, even though you're laughing.
That's really important.
He's
Right.
the one who's being the moral guy for you. So
Exactly.
the audience is allowed to go ahead with it and enjoy the goofy horror comedy of it all, because this guy's being the straight man for you, so you don't have to be straight man.
One of the things
That's interesting positioning.
It is, yeah. One of the things that really stands out to me, and it did the first time I saw it too, is like they think that it's over. They think that they're all dead but the virgin, and so they turn on the party music, and like that is going on in the background.
Yeah.
And just the differences between the tone there, I thought that was really probably the best dark comedy moment.
Yeah, no,
of
it's
the movie.
effective. Yeah.
And I
Very
remember
effective.
There's a really great like Michael Scott moment almost, where Sitterson tries to sass the guys from engineering.
Yes.
And it really reminded me of Michael Scott trying to sass like Daryl. Or...
You guys really blew it. And they're like, "What are we talking about?" Like they're not going along with it. Like
Yeah.
like these different offices just don't get along. Where it's like, yeah, we'll show up, but we're not really friends.
I remember the first time I saw that party scene, I thought that was going to be like the end of the movie. And I was kind of satisfied. I was like, oh, they all die, and it was all part of this game. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. But then, of course, it goes much further, and it was just even more fun,
And
And that's what made it really good.
Yeah.
Was that they kept it going, but then it wasn't like, oh man, they could have ended it like before. It just got even better. And we didn't conceive that it could really get better.
No. There was a couple spots where I thought this was like a natural ending because, like, A, we don't have the money, or B, like we thought this was good enough. And yeah, it goes way farther.
I think one thing they could have done is maybe had the extendo bong be like the stoner guy's creation or something, because he's an engineering student, and therefore he would know how to hotwire an elevator, because I feel like that was a little far-fetched.
It's kind of implied with all these things going on that, like, because we thought he was dead and he got dragged down there, that he also had the time, like, hey, look at this panel, let me figure out this wiring. And like, that's that's kind of a lot.
I don't know. It's just a little loose end
It
that
is.
could have been taken care of easily in a comical fashion.
That's where, yeah, you could do that. You definitely could do that. It's also one of those things where it's like he kind of cut it a lot of slack because it deals so much in cliche
Right.
and loopholes. Like there's constantly so many things like that, but it's kind of like, oh well, it's commenting on itself. So,
are there any specific scenes you want to talk about?
When we pulled back and we saw all the other monsters in those other little elevator boxes, like it was so effective. My heart was just singing. I figured this is one of the greatest things I've ever seen in my life, to see all these other things. It was like the ending of Evil Dead 2, where your heart's just singing. It's like, oh, this is so great. This is so amazing. This is I seldomly ever have this much fun watching a movie. And then when I'm thinking like, oh, please open all the boxes.
Yeah.
Open up all of them. Open up all of them at once. You know, and it does it for you.
That's actually, yeah, that's why it's so satisfying, because like you constantly, I do this all the times with movies. You're like, yeah, but what if this happened?
Yeah.
And then like the movie's like, hey, we're going to do that. Check this out.
It's great.
But then don't you feel bad that you're being so indulged with this movie when the movie is making fun of horror audiences being so indulged in their perverted pleasures?
Exactly. This movie basically has its cake and eats it too.
Oh, it's so good.
Yeah, that's why it's so effective. Where it's kind of like, you guys are disgusting for watching porn, but here's a 2-hour gangbang.
Exactly.
You guys suck, but watch this.
And I mean, have you guys talked to other people about this? Is this sort of a love it or hate it movie? Because I could really see that.
Who
being the
hates
case.
it? Who would hate this movie?
I haven't run into anybody that's hated it, but I've definitely noticed that people that ritually watch horror movies really love it. They don't feel like, oh, it's making fun of what I love. You know, it's not that. Mm-hmm. It seems like
it's not making fun of horror movies. It's an homage overall. I mean,
Oh yeah. This is like a Galaxy Quest for the Star Trek.
Oh,
fans.
that is good analogy there.
Another Sigourney Weaver.
So Galaxy Quest did it earlier too.
Yeah.
I'm sorry I let you get attacked by a werewolf and then enter the world.
You were right. Humanity. It's time to give someone else a chance.
Dana and Marty are basically sitting there at the end of the movie, and they're basically waiting for the end of the world. And they're saying, like, well, I guess it's time for somebody else to have a chance. That line works in terms of humanity. It's time for, humanity's had its time on the planet. But it also works in terms of filmmaking.
Yeah, let's see someone else make a movie.
Let's see somebody else make,
Yeah, so it shows you all the cliches, and it's, it has its fun, and then it says, let's give somebody else a chance.
It shows you all the cliches, and it shows you all the monsters, too. These are all the ones that have been done before.
I mean, don't you think that Evil Dead 2?
That was the
kind
Evil
of a
Dead
big-
house.
Yeah.
That was the Evil Dead cabin.
Yeah.
There are some Evil Dead shots in this movie.
And I can't really think of any one movie. That's the only time in the film where you're kind of like, oh, wow, like this is a definite nod to that movie. I mean, other than the obvious little things like the monsters and stuff like that. But that's the only time where you feel like, oh, that's from this movie. You're not thinking like, this is beat for beat this movie or anything. You
No,
can't
but
think of-
it was. You know what? The house was done so perfectly. I did kind of get a warm, nostalgic sort of feeling like visiting Shadow Moses and Metal Gear Solid 4, because the hallway was the same, the house was the same on the outside, and that the basement door was in the same position too, and it popped up. I was almost expecting to see that down in there, It was great. I felt good. It felt good visiting that place again.
that evil place.
Yeah, the
I love
evil
that
place.
evil
Aw.
I thought of the exact scene I want to mention, actually. It's a scene that's probably in every horror movie in the past 15, 20 years. So like, hey man, I dare you to do this thing, and then something bad happens. The scene with the wolf head. Even watching it again the second time, like, man, something terrible is going to happen. And it's just like this weird reaction to this drunk girl making out with a wolf's head.
But at the same time, you were aroused.
Well, I
I saw.
wasn't going to argue that. The
Were you expecting the wolf to do
Husband's
something? You were
bulge?
expecting the wolf to do something, or fall off the wall, or
fall off the wall, have a fake scare,
a
have
boom
it-
moment happens there?
Yeah, definitely, definitely. And what I was noticing the second time is watching people's reaction kind of gave me bearings on how to take this scene, where it's kind of like, this is weird.
Yeah,
it's playing it for comedy, not for a horror effect, which I thought was really, really good. But there's a couple of those where it's like the characters are realizing, like, this is really strange. Like, why are these things happening? Those really kind of keep you going through all of these pretty pat moments.
And maybe that's what makes the characters actually likable. Like, even though they're these cliches, they still notice that everything around them is kind of weird.
They're smart enough or human enough to notice it.
Yeah.
They don't do anything about it, though, because they get drugged and they can't.
Exactly.
There's so many things in their way that prevent them from doing anything about it. When you mentioned the idea of doing Cabin in the Woods, like, I instantly thought that was a great idea, because it was one of my favorite movies of this past year. I doubt anything is really going to kind of come much closer than that. Just in terms of going to the movies and seeing like a...
Yeah, I wish I saw this in the theater. I skipped it because the trailer looks stupid.
And that's another example of a bad trailer kind of... In most cases, I think it worked for all those
but
people.
how could they have done a trailer that did the actual movie justice? They couldn't.
You would have to not use any footage from the movie, basically. You would have to film something totally separate. You'd have to kind of like...
How do you not give the joke away, or
I missed the trailers. Did they pitch it as a
They pitch it as a straight horror movie.
Yeah. That's brilliant.
About teenagers that go into a cabin and bad things happen in there, and then an eagle crashes into a force field. There's more going on around here.
Yeah.
Guess you better see the movie to find out what's at the bottom of all this.
Right now, Steve is making a goofy face. He's crossing his eyes.
Yeah, sorry. I'm a very visual guy.
Is there anything else we want to say about Cabin in the Woods?
I just really hope that this movie becomes a franchise, because I cannot wait to see Cabin in the Hood.
Thanks for listening to the Snobcast. Please send any feedback to thesnobcastfeedback@gmail.com. Check out our Tumblr, YouTube, and Facebook accounts at username thesnobcast.
Look, you guys, you stay in the Rambler. I'll get help. If I wipe out, I'll fucking limp for help. But I'm coming back here. I'm coming back with cops and choppers and large fucking guns, and those things are gonna pay. For Jules.
Don't hold back.
Never do.
Welcome to episode 3 of the Snobcast. We will be discussing the movie The Cabin in the Woods. As always, this episode will contain spoilers. We will be discussing the movie from beginning to end.
How can the ritual be complete?
The virgin's death is optional, as long as it's last. Main thing is that she, suffers.
That she did.
It's so strange. I'm actually rooting for this girl. She's got so much heart. You think of all the pain and the... Tequila is my lady! My lady! Come on in, guys. Come on in, come on in. You're welcome. Tequila! From darkness, there is light!
So you think a lot of people went into the movie with misconceptions?
I think so.
So what is the movie? If we could talk about that a little bit.
What is the movie?
What is Cabin in the Woods?
It's a dark comedy.
Is that the best way to define it if you had to put it in a genre?
Yeah, it's a horror comedy.
It would fit a dark comedy really well, actually. But I'm trying to think of another example.
There is not one kill that happens that doesn't have a thing about it.
Yeah.
Well, what I think about it is that makes it kind of brilliant. Is it starts out with, a premise that it lets you know a little bit by bit by bit, and then when things finally spill over, you're engaged enough to where it's the most awesome thing that you've seen, in a horror movie.
That's what I felt like.
It just leads you every step of the way. By the time we're spoiling.
All right, welcome. My name's Jeff Bateman, and with me today is Steve.
But of course.
Joseph.
Yep.
And David.
Hello.
Cabin in the Woods is...
the cure for the common indie filmmaker.
Nerdgasm?
A movie.
That's very astute.
It's a message to new horror film directors.
Now, why is it a message to new horror indie film directors? I think it is because, the movie is just littered with cliches, but with each cliche, there's a hand and a button and a dial like working behind those cliches, so it kind of unravels it and makes them more plain and obvious, and it would give anyone wanting to make a slasher film more pause before they start committing those cliches, because then everyone around is thinking about the control room where they're working the gears and pushing buttons and stuff like that. You know?
Unless the most important thing to you as a producer or a filmmaker is that you make your money back, in which case you haven't seen Cabin in the Woods.
Does making a cliche mean you're going to get your money back?
I think most people would.
That's
would
very
say.
very cynical.
But I mean, how the slasher genre hasn't changed in 30 years.
Nope. They made it a big event, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. It's a message to new horror film directors that, you know, what not to do.
In fact, it's kind of like Scream,
And it's
except it takes it a step further.
It takes it.
It
I
takes
think,
it many steps further.
Yeah, I was
it
gonna
takes
say,
it into a whole other like dimension.
I was going to say it takes it probably a good 4 or 5 steps. There were several spots where I was like, oh, you know, this will be the end of the
And every
movie.
step is in the right direction too.
Oh, completely. Yeah, completely. I would say it's nerdgasm, just for that reason.
Because this could be for fans of horror movies too. You know?
I wonder about that. When I saw this in the theater and it was packed, and there were people that didn't know what the movie was. I didn't really either. I just
were they coming in from the trailer, which kind of sold it as kind of a straight
kind of slasher movie where it's kind of like, well, this is what you go see on a Friday night. You know, this is the time of year it is. It's also, by the way, this was released, if I remember right, in one of the dead zones, like probably like March, right? Like mid-March.
Yeah.
Where that telegraphs to me that the studio is like, well, we got to release this. We paid for it. We got to see if we can make our money back. And it's one of those cases where it's like they didn't really know what they had.